So, boy, thanks everybody for getting me their comments so long before I had to write up a memo and figure out our agenda. You'll get not A's, but something less. Anyway, I did appreciate the comments once I got them. They were interesting, they're helpful. You should pull up your Google Doc if you don't, and if you can. And I also hope everybody appreciated that I semi-mastered Google Doc, although I probably screwed it up a little bit this morning, but I tried. So here's what I plan to do today. And then I want to do a run through on the document for about an hour. And that's really what is listed on this outline. As I sort of went through and tried to pull out some of the bigger things, both some bigger things and some tinier things, so that we could just move through some stuff. It's not complete. Everybody's issue is not up here, but a lot are, I think. And it'll just give us a sense of where we are. And let me say, part of my hope on this is, at the end of the day, I hope that we're going to have some set of recommendations and we're going to come to some set of agreements. And if we're lucky, it'll be unanimous and it'll be a great consensus. And if we're less, it'll be, something less than that. But the goal is to get to as much consensus as we can while still having recommendations that meet people's hopes for getting a better instrument here. But we're not to that point. And that's why I say that, because part of what I think is that we need to understand each other more. And that's part of what I found so interesting in this document, both trying to write it and trying to put down some of my stuff. And as I said, trying to capture what I thought some other people thought about some things, but not trying to capture like things that I totally didn't understand or get. So this outline really is about trying to talk through some of the issues that we all see are there and trying to understand each other better and trying to figure out how we might say it, write it, recommend it better down the line. That's the goal. And then if we spend an hour on that, I've sort of laid out sort of an outline for that. Then I want to spend a little time just talking about what we're going to do at the May meeting. I think people mostly know, but we'll talk about that. And then sort of think about next steps. What more do we need to know? Who else we want to talk to? And then insofar as that relates to the next meeting. So does that sound good? All right. So what I've tried to do in this memo, whatever you want to call it, elaborated agenda, is pull in some of the stuff from the Google Doc, just so that to orient us, but we can also, everybody can go to their Google Doc to pick up some of the comments. But to begin with, framing purpose, goal, values, and let me say one other thing. Various people, I think mainly Jessica, sort of raised some questions about reordering and consolidating. I agree, I did a little bit of it. It wasn't my main thing right now, but I agree we need to do that. But for this one, I'm sort of pulling together framing, which was sort of Zach's way of sort of talking about original purposes, I think, sort of and then what is the purpose of the rating instrument? What do we think that is for? And then the goal of that, the goal of what we're trying to do with the review. And some people have talked about trying to frame all of this as what are our values. I think Aaron Cuny talked about beginning this process with design principles. That is, what are the ideas that should be governing the design of this? And I think Emily and maybe Betsy also talked about starting first with the values, although I think that, anyway, so this is sort of the place to talk about those things. Why are we reviewing it? What do we have to improve? What do we think the purpose is? What are the values we hope it reflects? And I put in there a set of questions that Zach raised about that. And then my own answer to why are we reviewing it.
And as I read what was a quick review and commenting, excuse the typos, the many typos, and it seems.
Oh gosh, yeah, no. And also, do people want to take a moment to look at what I wrote and also go back through their Google Doc? Would that be helpful? To take 5 minutes?
I
Yes.
think we should just jump in, would be my recommendation.
All right. Okay, well,
I think
right.
we jump right in.
all right. So somebody jump.
Can I just, looking at Zach's comment about the purpose of the report card being mainly to improve student learning. I don't know exactly how you put it, but my understanding, and I'm just looking at OSSI's site right now, is that it's one of the main is to help families choose schools, right? And I'm not saying that, you know, I agree with that or not, but here on the site, it says the DC report cards gives families a look into all public schools in the District of Columbia. Start here to learn more about how public schools in DC are preparing students for success in the next grade, college, or career. Yeah, okay, so I see how you're reading that. But from what I've heard, isn't it that is part of the reasoning behind having the stars, is to allow families to sort of get a sense of schools quickly and easily.
As a way of rating schools.
Yeah.
So I think I framed it a little differently. Like, one point is obviously to inform the public or families, but I think broader, the public, on the state of schools. And I don't know if this is on the website, but I've heard them several times talking about using it as a tool to improve our schools, to learn from what's working well in our highly star rated schools and share best practices.
So I'll just
Yeah.
jump in. I'm inclined to Zachary's framing of the idea that we review it to make sure that we are using a tool to evaluate schools that is able to analyze and interpret and assign value to equitable student outcomes. This school is doing a good job helping students achieve the best possible outcomes they can. This school is falling short of the goal we have for all able to achieve those outcomes. To your point, Emily, I think there are things in the city that are aimed at helping parents choose schools. I think My School DC, which displays the star rating, but also displays the DC school report card and also links to individual school profiles and the PMF and all those things. I think that is explicitly a tool that's to help parents choose schools. I think the star rating is meant to help people be able to quickly categorize schools meeting expectations versus schools falling short of expectations. And I do think that's a nuanced but really important distinction of this school meets the expectations we have for what a quality school is doing. This school is not. I think we evaluate the star system because we're not sure that right now it does that. But I think that's its intent.
You said that last part again. So your view of this committee's goal, if you will, is to review the star rating because we're not sure it's doing
What it's supposed to be doing.
And what was that? I'm sorry. I'm just trying to process what.
Identifying schools that are helping children standards and expectations, and schools that are falling short of that goal.
Got it. And so implicit in that, I would imagine that means you would agree that the star rating, so I'm playing devil's advocate. I can imagine someone saying, oh, well, doesn't the star rating tell you that schools that are meeting, and this isn't to Jessica, this is for everyone, are we accepting that we don't agree that the star rating does that? Tell us which schools are meeting expectations versus not.
Well, I think that's the idea of the research, or getting input from different researchers, right?
Here's how I would fall out. I would say that the star rating currently does disaggregate schools based on the metrics that are there. What we know, though, is that some of those metrics are complicated by bias that can be mitigated. Right now, we don't mitigate that bias. So yes, it sorts schools but bias measures. So our goal in reviewing it is to figure out, are there ways to keep achieving that purpose? Schools meeting expectations, schools falling short, but mitigating biases we know exist.
And one more follow-up question. This is great. I love this type of stuff. And so can you name, like, for example, what is a bias you think is baked into our current rating?
Sure. So I think right now, and this is from what we heard from Erin, the knowledge we have about proficiency scores is that they are more tightly correlated to race, income, risk status of students. Growth scores are less closely correlated. There are ways to use proficiency but mitigate the bias. We don't have those statistical controls in place.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
I think also, Zachary, something that Erin Roth has pointed out is that, and I may get this wrong, but she's talked about that using individual student level data, which OSSI has from Park, would be much more accurate than what we are currently using, which I think is data from the consortium, like we're comparing. No, I don't. So I said I would get that part wrong, but there was something where she was saying we have a lot of data that's individual student level data that we are not using. That would be much more accurate.
My understanding of the STAR report is that it is individual student data.
Yeah, there must be some aspects of it that
But I think maybe,
use.
I think, is it that it's like
I can try to find the notes now.
we're comparing one school's third grade to another school's third grade versus what Sean Reardon seemed to do in his research was track cohorts. So I'm comparing this cohort of students and following them over time to see what changed versus just how school X's third grade is performing year after year after year, albeit with different students.
I am not sure. Let me get back to you on it, but I think what I have understood from both Erin and Betsy, and then also from Erin and other conversations, I'm realizing that first of all, there's more data than is being used. That's what I've understood from Erin, and I can get details about that. And then Betsy and Erin, what I think I have understood is that there are different ways of using the data that is being used right now, that there are different ways of weighting it, that there are different ways of valuing, some more than others. So that's kind of, I guess, in your, going back to your question of where is it baked in, I think that just take numbers at face value and they don't realize there are different ways of looking at them, and that there's different kinds of data that you can compare, right? So anyway, I mean, part of me, of the report card, I don't think it's really important. It is a small difference, I think. What we were talking about before of like whether the main focus is on helping schools to improve their outcomes for students and also being a tool that families can use to, choose schools, to choose decide or identify a high quality school. But I do think that, that has been one of the critiques, is that, and Erin certainly spoke to this, that the predictable shakeout is what we've gotten, right? Where it's like schools with the highest number of at-risk students who end up looking like the schools you wouldn't want to send your kids to. And I think that's an important distinction there for it. So I think it's both, right? I'm not saying that the purpose is not to help schools improve, but I don't think we should say it's not also, to rate schools so that families can choose, whether or not that's the school that their students should go to. I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, and I think it's about both the intent and the consequence. Hey, what's up, yo? Yeah, but it's about both the intent and the consequence for sure, right? I mean, the fact is, right, there are a lot of families who say, yeah, I do look at the report card, I look at the star rating. Why would I want to send my kid to a 1-star school, right? They're not like, oh, okay, well, these are things I can thoughtfully think about how I can help the school community I'm committing to improve. They're like, oh no, if they're not doing this, I ain't going. And so really like thinking about like, both the intent and the consequences as a framework, I think is important.
I want to jump in on that front though, because I don't think we should be reviewing the state accountability system based on how some parents talk about the way they use the rating. And I say that because, to your point, Marcus, there are certainly parents I have heard in my ward say, I'm not sending my child to that school because it's a 1-star school. I have also heard enormous cohorts of parents saying, you only give my school 2 stars. Well, let me show you how great my school is and how I'm going to enroll year again. And that would be every white parent enrolled at Elliott Hine, who prides themselves on basically being like, take that 2-star school status, we're awesome. So I think if we try and peg our review to the way parents talk about school ratings, we are going to fall short on our real intent, which is, do we want to show whether schools are helping their students achieve their academic potential? And are we evaluating that in a fair manner? Versus are we responding to the whims of how parents talk about school ratings?
Yeah, I agree, but we also can't not assess the factors that may hinder the progress of improving those schools too, right? I mean, like precipitative drop off of like community support for schools, right? Which happened at Baloo, which happened at Anacostia, does in turn hinder their forward progress instead of bolster it in many ways. And I know that like it has also helped them like do things like get the
redesign,
right, and the redesign.
Huge community investment.
Yeah, but like if the rating is gonna be both like an internal benchmark for like system improvement, but also a public facing tool for families, like we've got to like figure out how to balance. You know what I'm saying?
Honestly, I don't, and that's why this conversation deeply frustrates me, because we know that every school is not doing what it can for every child in its building. And we know that that's complicated, right? We know that some of that is resource inequity, and we have to address that. But this tool does not address that. And this tool right now is actually not designed to address resource inequities that are handled at the council level. Like, we say that we want schools to get support in order to help their students meet their needs. But I don't agree that like, taking away the ratings doesn't fix the problems.
Yeah. Yes, and that is the spirit of my comment. And so just to make clear that not for us to just hash out our different perspectives, but I think as a committee, it would be helpful, Ruth, if at the top of whatever document we can align on whatever our goal statement is. And I really like this idea that Jessica mentioned around eliminating bias in our current framework. I think that resonates with everything I've heard from Emily and Marcus, and even our personal conversations, Ruth, about the STAR framework. And my point around our North Star and it needing to be around equity, and so the bias connection seems to fit perfectly there, or even around like student outcomes, is that I think as we hear from various interest groups, whether that's a teachers union, whether that's a PAVE, that they are coming with various perspectives, which are very valuable. I'm not discrediting that, but how we orient and how we approach and the questions that we entertain are going to be different, I think, if our North Star is we want to eliminate bias versus we want to ensure that teachers aren't punished versus we want to make sure that parents have as much information as they can. And I think part of, I wouldn't quite say frustration, confusion for me is, I think it's a very broad range just to talk about how do we improve our STAR framework, and we could do a better job of just narrowing like what our end goal would be. Does that make sense, Ruth?
I just realized the reason no one's listening to me is because my mic was off. Hope you enjoyed your conversation. No, but I mainly was listening. So, but let me try to pull this together for a moment. It seems so. One is, so this is what I take from it. At least one important purpose of, actually, regardless of whether it is to improve the school or recommend, make it possible for parents to choose. I think what we have agreement on is the rating needs to reflect some reality that is not biased. And we can come back and sort of figure out what exactly we mean by that, although I think we're fairly close, but it seems to me that's what we're looking for is the reason we're all having this conversation is because at some level we think the rating isn't necessarily reflecting the quality of the school. And this is a conversation aimed at making that more accurate, less misleading, less biased. I know there's issues around which words we use, but that's
where I would push, Ruth. And so our goal for doing that is to ensure that we are closing inequities, gaps and inequities in the city, or we're ensuring that more of our kids are graduating, whatever that statement is, anchored around student outcomes or an equity perspective. And what I've heard.
Well, wait, let me just stop you for a moment, Zach. I mean, I think they're two separate things. One is there is sort of an in what way does this tool fit our broader effort to close the gaps and improve schools? That's one question, right?
They are separate, but the reason why I think that North Star is going to be important is because our solutions or our proposals are going to vary. So for instance, this proposal of eliminating the STAR framework altogether, if we're saying our goal is to eliminate gaps and or increase the numbers of students who are graduating ready to enter college or succeed in the world, that solution doesn't seem to really get towards that goal. Now, if our North Star is we want fewer teachers fired, if we want fewer schools closed, then yeah, eliminating the STAR framework might get to that. And my concern is our focus should be on student outcomes and eliminating inequities that exist in the system.
But I'm just trying to distinguish two things here. No rating system is going to, on its own, get rid of inequities in the system. That's a big, huge thing, and maybe this has a place in it. And I think we want to think about the role of this tool in that broader goal. This alone doesn't solve that. What I think everybody agrees with, I think, is that whatever our broad frame, and I'm not saying we can't come back to it, we want it to, I guess I'd say two things, one which we agree on and one which we may not. That whatever it says, we want it to be said in a way that is, again, I'm going to use different words, unbiased, less misleading, more accurate. We want it to reflect a reality. And I think everybody is on board for that. The part of that may be, well, it's the next thing I want to get to is what do we mean by quality? Because we may or may not all be in the same place. But so we all agree, the thing we want to fix is that thing, whatever it is that is preventing this from, again, my set of words. And I think everybody is nodding for that, which is a plus. That's good. Okay.
It only took many months for us to get to this point. So you're on a roll, Ruth.
Right. Okay. So I'm just gonna I'm putting in my own notes that's where.
Can I
yeah.
just ask, and not to put you on the spot, but why does that matter? So to me, that's the what. So why? Why do we want to eliminate the bias or make it less?
So I would answer by saying, I think it responds to a lot of things. One, if you want to use it as a tool to improve, you want to make sure you're identifying the schools that are genuinely strong, right? If you want to use it to identify the schools that need help, you want it to be identifying them accurately. If you think that it is hurting some schools misleadingly, you'd want to fix that. Now, I think there's another thing which Marcus raised, which I'm not sure we want to come to it today, but we have to come to it, which is the idea that whatever its usefulness and however accurate it may be, it may also be hindering schools from improving and hurting them. And I think that's a reality. Certainly some people definitely believe that to be the case, and I think it's something we need to grapple with. But I'm not sure we want to do that today. I'm inclined to put that on the next. But
Well, I guess, can I just say, I guess that is the crux of it for me, the rating aspect of it is what are we, what is the purpose of the rating? Or maybe putting it a different way, what is the intention? What intention does, OSCE have of supporting? We find out that they are not where they start, right? And if that's really the main purpose of it, to sort of identify so we can support, then yeah, that's important and powerful. But it hasn't been clear entirely like what the follow-up is to a 1 or 2 star, right? It's, there are some schools that get identified as to get some extra money, but it's clear that that's not all that they need and that it's not enough, right? And that not all of them get it. To Marcus's point, that I think one thing we haven't talked about is that these schools are part of a system that we want to be strong. We want to have a strong school system that supports all students and all families, right? And my fear with when you have, it's families deciding where to go to school, but that does impact, the ability, our ability to have a strong overall system. Right? So that's where I guess I question the star rating. Am I going in and out?
Nope.
Okay, guys, I'll just went blank. Sorry.
One thing I'd be curious about in terms of the notion of a rating is, in Ruth's document, she asked about what ESSA requires. So I think that is a key question. My understanding is that ESSA does require that you at least rank and categorize schools. So I think the question of eliminating a rating versus not eliminating a rating has a policy piece. The second question is, in the data that Erin shared, if we were to use some of these corrective techniques to correct for a bias that is currently baked into the ratings, we're going to see some highly regarded, highly affluent schools get bad ratings. And that to me is an important piece of fixing the bias and showing which schools are making progress. I think it forces us to confront some of the questions that Ruth notes are not going to be solved purely by this system, which suggests that the other way that we know parents make choices about schools has very little to do with the star rating and has an awful lot to do with race and privilege and power and the peer groups that attend those schools. So I think it will help us in some ways ask a question that says, okay, we've corrected for bias in the system. we've got these ratings, and now we're showing that this school that everyone spent an awful lot of money to buy a house to be in zone for, as it turns out, isn't growing its students very much at all. I think that's a really important factor in conversation around what do we mean when we talk about school quality, and which of our schools are moving the needle instructionally, academically, helping children progress towards the kind of expectations we want for our students.
Mention that, you know, we're in a specific context here in DC, right? Like, so if we're in a school district where there is a real emphasis on strengthening the system and on collaboration between schools, and, you know, when you had that kind of outcome Jessica's describing, whether it's in a school that's serving wealthy students or high-risk students, there would be the response would be to sort of rally around that, how to support it. But I don't think we're in that, you know, school choice system where that's sort of that's a very important part of the culture, I would say. You know, that parents to choose, and that isn't sort of this sense of like, we need to have a strong school system. And so even if it's a school like the one Jessica is describing, I still don't see it as healthy. You know, it's not a healthy outcome, because what happens next then for that school?
Is that right now we don't do that. Like, I don't see how taking the rating away builds us that system. You want us to build that system, and I get that, but I don't think that having a rating or taking away the rating builds that system. So either we're honest about the lack of consistency and quality of outcomes schools are getting for their students, or we don't talk about it. But neither of those things changes the fundamental nature of the system you're describing. So that's why I don't think it's a good idea to take away the rating, because at least then we're honest about the discrepancies in the system.
Well, could I just say, I think the families who've experienced the discrepancies in the system have been talking about it long before we had a rating, and we knew the type of investments we were supposed to make. Right now, whether the star rating helps further, right, helps further motivate the folks who are supposed to make these investments to actually make them after decades, or it hinders the ability for those schools to actually build both, like the human capital to actually get things done long term. I think it's the balance we've got to strike. If we lessen some of the bias in the rating, then maybe we get closer to that goal of not hindering schools more than we help them. But I'm not gonna. But I don't think like the star rating was a good way to organize this information, but it didn't help us discover it at all. We knew that these were issues, right?
All right.
And so taking away the rating doesn't help us. That's my point, is that we've had the rating for exactly 2 years, and people are up in arms over something that people just ignored for a long time before we had the rating.
So I'm going to intervene. And here's where I'm going to leave this. There are disagreements about what the ultimate effect is of having a rating system, period. And that, I think, has to be acknowledged somewhere if some group of people is going to sign on to this. That said, I think where the agreement is, which is not to say this is where it ends, but there is agreement, I think, from everybody that it would be a plus to make these ratings, again, my words, you know, less biased, more accurate, less misleading. That everybody is for. Is that right? Okay. All right. Then the second thing this is to Jessica, and I think to Alex, which is on the.
I'm sorry to be a stickler here, Ruth, but yes, that is the goal for the express purpose of blank. And I think that blank needs to be anchored around an equity perspective for students. We're not just doing this for the sake of doing it. We're not doing it for any other. I think we should be crystal clear why we're doing this.
Yeah, helping schools improve toward that end, right?
And I would even go, yes, I would go even further to say, and let's think about students and just like have a statement about what we want to be true for students in DC.
But can I just say, given our school system that I've described, can we also add that part of the objective is also to do that, what we're saying, to improve schools and to strengthen our school system as a whole?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's an important thing to keep in mind when you have the degree of school choice that we have.
Yeah. And so, yeah, to that point, maybe it's three. Yeah. I know it might seem like splitting hairs, but I do think symbolically it's important, but also it's going to be important how we frame it and what we entertain as a potential solution.
No, I like your idea of the North Star. I think it's important, or an anchor. Maybe one is in the down and one is up, but you know, something that keeps us focused.
But Emily, to your point, that deeply resonates. This idea of like having the tool and tweaking the tool is one thing, and there is value there. But like, what do we do with it? What should OSSI do with it? What should our city do with that rating to improve schools? That totally resonates.
I'll just say one more thing, which is that what Zach just said, and getting closer to having as little bias as possible, like getting as close to accurate as possible is most important, right? Like if we had that and we still had the star rating, I wouldn't be so upset.
That if it identified schools in a way that was accurate and led to them getting the support they needed, whether it was resources, that would be, you drop a lot of your concerns.
Yeah, I think so. It's just,
All right.
I prioritize that over removing the ratings. Yeah.
Ruth, I know you're trying to move us along. I will just throw out there, several months ago, and I still feel this way, that I was trying to get a sense of whether OSSI has a school support office. I know there's like a teaching and learning office, but I know, like, for instance, in Massachusetts, their department or their school system, they have like a school improvement office with the explicit stated goal of our lowest performing schools are going to receive support. So just throwing that out there is that ultimately this could morph into there being a division of people whose sole purpose is to help improve schools.
Yeah, and I mean, just to say, I think that while we don't have that, Zach, and maybe we should or whatever, there are places in the city that, at least in theory, aim for that, right? I mean, the charter school board does something, I don't know, you guys would know better than me, to identify and support some schools. OSSI has a small group of schools. It may not be enough resources, it may not have the right North Star, but
how powerful would it be if
I already know it would be very powerful.
But if a school was up at the charter board because their PMF didn't meet a certain threshold and they're up for closure, and that school is now being held accountable to the plan and support that OSSI helped them develop, and whether or not they implemented that. I'm connecting it to the conversation yesterday we had with Ruth. We had yesterday with special education advocates, and this idea of like, in many ways, we're calling on OSSI to be more muscular in its dealings with schools and students.
So I'm just going to jump in for 1 second on the role of PCSB, because this is like it's a sticking point for me as a person who did a whole dissertation on charter schools. PCSB is the authorizer. Its job is not to assist schools in improvement. It is to identify places. No, it's really important that I get the whole thing out, Ruth. It's about what they are or are not doing in accordance with the terms of their contract. If PCSB were to get involved in helping schools improve their quality, it complicates their ability to both open and close them, because then it's like, hey, we opened you and we told you had to do these things. Now we're trying to help you do those things. Oh, you failed at those things. We're closing you. Well, did the school fail or did the authorizer fail? So PCSB identifies, but they don't do the support. And I think it's an interesting question as to whether OSSI could and should build out that capacity, because then it could be across all LEAs, not a DCPS charter school separate system thing.
Okay. No, thank you, Jessica. I was always actually a little bit confused on that, so I appreciate that. I want to go back to this issue about ESSA and what ESSA requires. And if Alex is here, is Alex here? Wait, oh, and Josh, oh, hi, Josh. I'm just seeing we have other people online. Okay. Hello. I just saw the names. Wait, Alex is there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. But here's my question about ESSA. It is my understanding that under ESSA, you must collect and report the proficiency scores, as Jessica said, but it is not necessary to rank them and grade them. And that in fact, there are states that do not do that. We can all have different views about what we want to do, but I want to be clear on what ESSA requires. Am I right, or are you not sure?
That's right.
Sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Alex. I'm looking at you. How could you not know?
So, I mean, my understanding is, and to Jessica's point, yes, like the proficiency scores are a requirement of ESSA. I view that it is a requirement that they are part of the accountability system. Again, when we get to the nitty-gritty of the accountability system, whether or not there does need to be a summative score, you know, that's a whole other question. But my view is that ESSA does have a proficiency requirement for the accountability system.
And that you also have to have, be able to identify the lowest 5%. So Ruth, sorry, so can you mute, because when you type, it is really loud.
Yeah.
Sorry. So I'm not sure how the other states are doing this, and I think there are differences on how they, I'm sure, are doing it, but how you designate the lowest 5% without some sort of scoring mechanism. Whether that's a summative score, which I think is probably, go ahead, Ruth, sorry.
I mean, I think the way some of them do it is they take the proficiency score or they take the growth score. They take a metric that they pick and they say this is the basis on which they're doing it. And it may be that they have to do it on the proficiency based on what Alex is saying, but it's.
Yes,
That
and
would
that,
make our
again,
system less fair than it is now, given what we know about bias and the proficiency scores.
Yeah, no, I'm not standing up for it or down for it. I'm just saying as a matter of fact, I think that's, in other words, states are allowed, as I understand it, to pick the bottom 5% based on either the proficiency, based on something that says what are the lowest, whatever the words are, the bottom 5%. They figure out a way to define the bottom 5%.
Right.
It was my understanding that the accountability framework that you put together, that's how you have to identify the 5%. I don't think you can identify individual metrics, but I can certainly go back to the law and look at that again too.
I'm just going to put this down in the list of, we need an answer to this. Some states do something like that. So we need to really understand what the rule is that allows that and sort of what the space is for that.
I'm sorry, to do something like what? Not use proficiency at all? Is that what you said?
My understanding is you have to collect and report proficiency data.
Yeah.
You don't have to put it into sort of a framework the way we have it. And secondly, you need a way of identifying your bottom 5%. And I'm not sure what the rules are on that. If it can be all proficiency, all growth, I'm not sure.
And Emily, can I ask this question as a follow-up to that? So I know one thing that we just discussed at length was concern over what it would mean to label a set of schools and how that is perceived by parents. Given what we just heard, ESSA requires that at a minimum, we identify and publicly name schools that are the bottom 5% on our framework for performance. So that might mean that we had schools and then we had bottom 5 schools. So we might do away with all the other ratings, but we would still have to call out the bottom 5 schools. Does that, I mean, how does that sit with both of you? Because to me, having this spectrum of like, we've got schools and schools perform in all these different ways and different supports are needed for schools all along the spectrum feels to me like a much more accurate way of communicating how schools are doing than schools bottom performers.
Can I just say one quick thing, which is, I'm not sure that you have to publicly call them out on the reporting document, the 5%. I know you have to know who they are so you do something about it. I don't know that it's part of a public calling out. I'm not sure.
That would be public information. We couldn't hide that from the public, right? That would be very
Right.
anti-transparent.
Right. And I could respond. I mean, I think if it is a hurtful thing, I'm not saying I think that, to do it for 5% instead of 100% of the schools is probably a plus, but I'm not going there. But where I do want to go, where Emily can get in, is I think we should find out what the rules are instead of hypothetically arguing this out. Be my recommendation.
So in the chat, I put a link from EdTrust related to ESSA that I'll make sure is in the packets as well for moving forward, so we can all have the same resources. But we will absolutely have the list of sort of the chart of what is required, what is not, and that type of thing.
The chart, and also, John Paul, very important, the list of states that don't rate, and on what basis are they able to do that, and how do they do their 5%?
Okay.
So it's both the rules and in practice, how does that play out?
And just to make this clear, I mean, I'm fully aware that there are some states that are using what some members of the board refer to as dashboards as well. And I know those states also call them dashboards. And I mean, I personally look at California's, and I know it's called the California dashboard or whatnot. But when I look at those metrics, in my view, there's not a summative score, but there is still a rating of sorts for each of the categories. I think you look at them and you still see, I think they use like a gas metric almost, right? Where you have like a red, yellow, and green, which is still, in my opinion, indicative of something that is somewhat summative and calculated, in that a rating is being assigned.
Alec, I don't want to go down this road now. I very much want to go down it. And I think one of the things I'm going to put in our list of next things is to better understand exactly that. What do these dashboards look like? How do they meet the ESSA requirement? I know at an earlier point, Jessica had raised the question of how do parents view this? I think data quality may, have some surveys or reviews of, is this harder or easier for parents? So I think there's a collection of things to look at around that. I'm just putting that as a holder.
And Emily, I just want to be clear, like I firmly oppose the idea of us moving away from our current rating system. And I know that not everybody feels that way, but I do want to make sure that as we talk about points of agreement and points of disagreement, that is a key point of disagreement. That I don't want to go to a dashboard system. I do think that some sort of summative rating is appropriate, and I would be disappointed to see this state board move away from it.
That is captured, very much captured, and it's in your, and it's well captured in the Google Doc. So it'll. I mean, we're gonna have to. There's going to be things where we're diametrically opposed and things where we're not. And part of what I want to do is try to get to a place where we can sort of organize those, and then we can figure out how to go forward. I don't know how else to do it. But I totally hear you, Jessica, and it will certainly be reflected. Am I off again? No. Sorry. Okay. Okay. I am going to move us along. So to some extent, I think we captured a lot of this first part, not completely. I'm going to jump to number 2. What do we mean by quality? There was a back and forth in the chat about parent engagement. And then there's this big issue around proficiency. It's 2:57. We have until 3:30. I feel like maybe we can handle both what's at the public meeting and what we want to do next in 15 minutes, unless other people have big plans for that section. Is anybody concerned about collapsing that into a single 15-minute period? Okay. So on this number 2, what do we mean by quality? There's a few sort of dilemmas here. Let me just raise them. One is the idea of parent engagement, which I know Emily had weighed in on. I think Jessica took some, didn't take some, but I think both of you had some parent engagement stuff in there. And then Zach was not convinced that that should be part of it at all. So do we want to have a conversation about that for a moment? I mean, I'll just, other people go in, I mean, the question is quality, right? We just spent a whole bunch of time talking about test scores, and what else goes into quality? That's really the question. And some of it started to come out in the document. And that was one of them. The whole idea about school climate, and there's I think my sense was everybody thinks that a whole lot of these different ideas around climate really are important parts of quality. That doesn't necessarily resolve, therefore, how do you measure it? That's sort of another question, but they're all important parts of it. So my question really is we want to talk about the parent stuff and what else goes there? And then I want to raise something on the proficiency.
As I stated in the document, when I think many people talk about quality schools, they are thinking about student outcomes. And for better or for worse, right now, our system has set a standard around performance on standardized assessments to dictate those student outcomes. I can see a world where graduation rates and other metrics for that are included. The one thing I would say, obviously, parent involvement and engagement, obviously, parent opinions are important. I don't want to suggest that, you can have piss poor parent engagement and have a great school. But again, I think our North Star has to be to what end. And if a school is not getting students to meet a certain threshold, but parents are thrilled, I don't think that's a quality school. That's just somewhere where families are happy. And I would just give the example, not so much here in DC lately, but growing up in Chicago, there were many schools that were closed, and time after time, despite how awful that school might have been, you could bet there was going to be a protest. Parents are going to say, I love this school. Granted, no one's graduating, no one's on grade level, no one's getting a job, because obviously that school serves various meanings and purposes, and we can talk about that another time. But our goal should be around what are the student outcomes in terms of education offerings that school is producing. And so that's why I think parent perception sometimes can be skewed and shouldn't therefore be included in how we define school quality. Just my 2 cents.
Who wants to get in? I got something, but other people first.
I think it's an important factor. I don't think it's, I don't think it's a standalone factor by any means, but I do think it's part of the picture. And I think schools where families don't feel that they're welcome, or where they don't feel respected, that that does reflect on the quality. And I do think that that is a aspect of school quality that is more likely to cut across socioeconomic class than others. I don't know if that matters, but I'm just saying that's true. But I just think part of the, if we're talking about school quality, I definitely think that how parents feel about the school should be part of it.
Jessica?
I think my concern with that is where this call began, which is there's a father around the corner from me who feels like all the screen time his children are having required of them during distance learning is too much, that it's inappropriate for children their age, that he wants no part of the screen time. And another parent I connected with last night who was desperate to get Wi-Fi hotspots because she's been disconnected for weeks. And to her, that felt like disrespect. The kid goes to the same school. And I think the notion of putting parent engagement in makes good sense, but giving it as much weight as academic outcomes runs the risk of a different parent is going to feel differently about whether they are respected, engaged, cared for. I also will say that my experience with Ward 6 is that parents of different classes often feel very different about how respected or how engaged they are by school community. And so while we may reveal issues about racism and classism in our schools, I don't think our school accountability framework is well equipped to address those.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. The last point you just made about families from different, demographic backgrounds feel differently, and that I think would be great to capture, but I know it'd be difficult and also tricky just ethically. But I think it would be useful for schools to capture that. And just to clarify, I completely agree. I don't think it should have the same weight. I just think it should be one piece of the puzzle. I don't think we should take it out altogether.
You're on mute, Ruth.
So I'm capturing that there's at least some feeling from more than one person that it should be captured, but certainly shouldn't be as much as outcomes. So I'm just capturing that. The question that I want to sort of put forward, partly to Zach, but to everybody, and I think there's some research that could go around this, is I think that engagement. So my issue in part on the ratings in general is, and I keep talking about it, is, test scores are a lagging indicator, right? Test scores say that we've now gotten everything into shape and everybody's now performing. What I care the most about, and it's something that Josh and I talked about at the very beginning of this, is what you don't want to do more than almost anything is you got a school that's on its way. It's clearly on its way. It's doing all the right things. And if you could just hold on a year or two, you'd see it in the scores, but you don't yet, because that's just not the way improvement works. So to me, trying to figure out if there is a genuine way to capture with pretty good accuracy. Look, we know none of this is perfect, right? But with pretty good credibility and accuracy, aspects of something that's not a test score, that tells you, that indicates you are likely on the right track. That's really important. And my recollection is that part of what the University of Chicago Consortium did with their surveys was to identify particular aspects of both the parent and student surveys, maybe parent, student, and teacher surveys, I can't remember, where there were particular indicators that going back, you really could look and say, wow, that really captured something. And I remember some of them were that, the child himself felt like, I feel challenged was one of them. And I feel safe, I think, was one of them. And there were ones for parents, and there may have been ones for teachers. And I'd be very interested in trying to identify that, whether it's through surveys or maybe there's other indicators. I mean, I feel like teacher retention does that to some extent, because it tells you something about the culture of the school being strong enough to not be losing people left and right. So,
Oh, sorry.
no, so I'm just saying, I would like for us to kind of pursue this. If there's some interest in that, and I see heads nodding, to try to pursue that. ask some researchers about it, go back to University of Chicago.
I think also, another reason to include more indicators rather than fewer. So that would include family engagement, or however you want to frame it, family satisfaction, is so that you can sort of look at are there patterns in schools that are getting, 1-star or 2-star ratings? Do they also have really low parent engagement scores? Do they also, you know what I mean? You can look at the other indicators to see if there are also patterns there that can be addressed. And I think that is something that the Chicago Consortium was able to do, right, with some of their data, was to identify some of the factors that were present in high achieving schools. So they could then, use those to help the schools that weren't doing well improve. So I think there are two things. I think that there's more to capture than just test scores, as we've talked about a lot. That's important, but also, on the other side of like wanting to understand how to help schools improve, I think it's also good to have those indicators to look to. Unmute, Ruth.
One day. And anybody else on that before we move on, Zach?
I just think about it, just to reiterate, in terms of inputs and outputs. And what I'm hearing you all talk about, which I agree with strongly, I would consider inputs.
Well, they are inputs, but the question is, they are inputs. The question is, do you want a rating system that only tells you the end result, or do you want a rating system that lets you know whether or not a school is operating in a fashion that is leading to a very good end? I mean, that's the thing is
I don't know if that's the question at hand. So I totally agree that if there was a way to capture that and report out on it in our report cards, that could be beneficial. But the question at hand is, how do we define quality? And I would suggest that we define quality by the outputs produced by the schools.
Okay.
Yeah, but just
I want to push back on that sort of in your own terms, which is, if you do that, if you define quality only in terms of outputs this spring, you will inevitably give low grades and demoralize, and as part of what Aaron was talking about, you will give poor grades and demoralize and perhaps stymie the recruitment of schools that are well on their way, that in an effort to be true to capturing outcomes, because that's good for schools and families, you will have the effect of really hurting a set of schools that are really on their way. And by on their way, I'm not talking about in 10 years, but you don't see the result. You know this, you don't see the result of what a teacher did or a school did tomorrow. It's just not how it works. And you need, seems to me, to be serious about quality. We're talking about quality. Quality isn't just outcomes. Quality is the quality of the education somebody's getting. And we want indicators that indicate whether students are receiving that quality of education. Now, I agree, it may not be possible, it may not be easy, but I think there's some reason to think it is viable to find reasonably good indicators of that. We need to look. But if we don't, we're not judging quality in full. We're only judging the effects of, the last 5 years. You hear what I'm saying? Anybody else on this?
I think I would just say this, Ruth. I think that the inputs a school gets on some of these are, let's say for a second, we could hold constant all the inputs, right? And I actually think DC has continually tried to design a policy system that tries to do that. It doesn't achieve it, but it has tried to do that. We would still have variable outcomes. So I think the question is like, there are other ways for us to affect the inputs, but the accountability system is for us to account for what you do with the inputs you have. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in the district on creating equitable inputs. And I've said this both before the council and to the group of MIPA students the other day. For DC, I think that needs to look like reparations. I think it needs to look like some schools that have long been getting a huge input of additional inputs, while others are held constant or perhaps even curtailed. We can do that in policy, not the report card. I think here it's the question of what are we getting out of inputs we put in.
It should be
So
the,
I want to go back to, wait, I just want to, I want to write this down properly. I think what Jessica said at the beginning is that, am I on?
yes,
That the goal is, the goal of this rating is not to capture, I wrote this, not to capture what the inputs are, but to capture what the outcomes are given what the inputs are. Is that correct?
Correct. And I think we have work to do to get the inputs to a place that is fair and proper for all of our students. But I think our accountability system is trying to measure what we get out of school communities based on inputs put in.
But there also might be some value in holding both schools and the district accountable for the inputs that we know all students need, right? Which and putting it in an accountability system doesn't give them the room to not provide those inputs for the students who need it most.
Wait, say that again, Marcus.
What I'm saying is, I think putting some of those inputs that we know are necessary for student success and for developing the type of school culture that we know students need to be successful, like both holding the school and the district accountable for those inputs in an accountability system also gives less room for that inequity, right? Because if you're going to be scored on what you're putting in, right, obviously it's going to improve what you put out. But if we don't hold those schools accountable for what they're putting in, it just, again, what you measure, right, gets done, and the inputs are just as important in my mind.
I think I'll say two things to that, Marcus, because I get what you're saying and I agree with it entirely. I think one, the council is not getting a score on this report card. And the council has like top responsibility for the inputs, right? They're setting budgets. The LEAs are also not getting scored here. The only place LEAs get scored are by the PCSB, where they get permitted to keep open all their campuses or they're told they have to close some of their campuses. But nobody holds the LEA accountable. And I think that's the other place where the inputs are happening. So like DCPS may not be handing out resources in a way that gives all the schools the inputs they need, but this report card doesn't hold, the star rating doesn't hold DCPS accountable, because you know, some of their schools will do well, some of their schools will do poorly, but there's no accountability for that. So what I guess I'm getting at is like, we can't use this report card to hold those places where the inputs come in accountable. And then it says that we're, you know, holding it on a principal's head or an LSAT's head in a way that we have a lot of work to do on that. I do think the outcomes, like what you do with what you have, is what we can hold a school accountable for. We can't change what they get with this report card. We can only say, given what you got, here's where you are. All the work of getting them what they need happens outside of this system.
Which again, just I guess has all of us circle back to, I guess just had all of us circle back to like the argument of like, let me get my thought together. I'll type.
I will say, I mean, I guess that's interesting. Just isn't that what we were saying earlier, is that the report card shouldn't be divorced from what input schools get. That
You're misunderstanding me. I think we have to say to schools, we need to see what you can show us you can do with the children you get every year. And I think we have to account for correcting for biases that we know exist in the system now. However, we cannot say, oh, well, you didn't get the inputs and you got different inputs than that school, so we can't rate you because that's not fair. No, it's our job to get them the inputs they need. And that's policy work, that's funding work, that's work that we as elected officials ought to be part of doing. But I don't think it changes that we have an accountability system that says, given what you got, here's what produced.
Right. Okay. I got you. It doesn't change the rating that school gets.
Yeah, not for me. Like I feel really strongly that, like, you know, there are some schools that are getting a lack of inputs and they're still getting really great results. And then there are other schools getting that same lack of inputs and they're not getting those great results. And I think that differentiation matters.
But I think, so maybe this is a segue, I don't know, unless there's more to be said here, but it does seem to me that is what Betsy and Aaron were getting at, you know, that there are different ways of measuring and that will create different outcomes that maybe are more fair. And that's what I think we're trying to get. I saw Josh posted something, you know, about collecting 3 years worth of student data for each school. Like, that is what I think is interesting here, right? Like, is thinking about, can we get at something more or deep or more accurate? You know, could we be doing better at, you know, when we look at the score, understanding that it means something closer to what the school community would say, yeah, we're struggling with that, or, you know, yeah, you know, we really worked hard on that and that's what we got.
But I think there's an important nuance in how some people are discussing inputs, i.e. like funding or support, and not to put words in Betsy or Aaron's mouth, and those who view the students themselves as inputs. And so I think that's an important distinction, because I would venture to argue that some would say, oh, well, of course, schools in this part of the city are having different outcomes in this number of schools because the students are different. And I think we need to reject that, and which is in part why this argument for growth, which it resonates. I get the idea of like measuring the impact that one teacher can have in one classroom. However, but how is that not separate but equal? And saying, because you grew up in this neighborhood and you go to this school and your family looks and or makes this, we expect you to hit this threshold, and these kids over here, we only expect you to hit this threshold.
I just wanted, we don't have a lot of time to do this, but the point that Zach is raising is the one that I wanted to go to next, so we'll just have to delay it, which is, to me, the growth and proficiency thing is really huge in this sense. The proficiency, I agree with you, Zach, it reflects where we want students to go, and we need to have different ways to encourage, make that happen, whatever verb we want to use. To me, that's distinct from saying this school is failing because so many students aren't proficient when they didn't have a lot to do with that. I mean, I was just reading an NWEA study that said, at least at the high school level, I don't know if it was true, 17% of the proficiency rate, whether the 17% of what goes into the proficiency was what a student learned that year. I mean, so the question to me is is there a way to make these distinctions that you don't lose the idea that proficiency is the goal, that is the goal, and there is some accountability piece around it, but it's not put on an individual school to be judged because, I mean, if you have a school that is helping students progress, we'll just say 3 years in the space of 1, right? The students are still very far behind.
And
it feels like we want to recognize that.
And that looks different on the school. So for instance, our comprehensive high schools, a Dunbar, a Eastern, et cetera, like, yeah, I think that really resonates, Ruth, because you have students coming in the 9th grade with that have not been served by our system. and a school essentially has a year and a half to get them up to speed before they're dinged for it. That's very different than elementary and middle school when the scores that are coming out of those schools are in large part because of the quality of instruction that they receive.
So I just want to say, but so you're,
Not
so
close.
this, at the high school level, you're open to that idea that proficiency may not be the best way to determine whether it's the quality is. I mean, you're not being committed to it today, but I'm just wanting to sort of capture that.
Can I add to that, Ruth? I think
One
another-
last, and I'll promise I will monitor my airtime better. I wouldn't say I would be more apt to not leaning on proficiency at the high school level, but I do think there is something to be said about time, the time afforded to a high school between when students come in the door, in particular our comprehensive high schools, and when they are assessed in 10th grade. And the thing I wanted to say is that is in part why I'm so for these professional learning plans. Shout out to Marcus and our grad task force. And that's one of the recommendations that they made, that if we were able to have a POP for each student that they were tracking throughout their tenure, then we would be able to see more of these trends versus clumping all students in all high schools together as if they had the same narrative and patterns, which isn't true. That's all I want to say.
Emily?
I was just going to add to the complication of comprehensive high school or rating high schools in general is that at the high school level, you do have, students going to selective schools and, going to different kind, I guess that is the main issue that I've heard from the principals of comprehensive high schools is that since you're kind of getting much more, I don't want to say weeded out, but separated set of students, that how schools are going to be rated, high schools are going to be rated is much more predetermined than at the elementary level.
And I would push on that, the nuance, because see, and not splitting hairs, but that's the inputs argument. That, and I know that you don't mean it that way, Emily, but what I hear when I hear that is, oh, well, we're getting those kids, or we're getting the bad kids. I know that's not what you meant, which is very different than saying, in many of our comprehensive high schools, there are students who have compounded years of poor instruction. And so, in other words, it's like, what is the root of the problem?
It's not just that, it's also they don't test well. So there's some of that.
Perhaps,
And
but
then,
the root of the problem is not that the good kids or the high scoring kids went to another school. It's because those kids have compounded years of poor instruction and or a host of other things that likely is true for them. So language matters.
Duly noted. Unmute, Ruth.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So I have a lot of notes. Staff has a lot of notes. I'm going to try to reorganize some of this into capturing where we agree, where we don't agree. Some of the things that we didn't get to, I'm going to explicitly, like there's a whole, if you go through the the Google Doc, there's a whole bunch of things where people don't have comments. I'm inclined to think it's because there basically is agreement. So I think what I'm going to do is go through and just acknowledge that and let people just indicate that I'm wrong or that I'm right, because if I'm right, that's what it means, there is a lot of agreement, which is not to say there's not also a lot of issues. So that's what I'm going to try to do is one next step. I'm also going to try to capture some of these dilemmas, pros and cons in ways that allow us to either put them on the side or capture them as dilemmas or capture them as something we can live with that's sort of somehow apart from final decision. I don't know. So that's on me, and I'm going to try to do that soon. And then, okay, now I'm moving to I'm also going to capture a couple of things that came up here about things we want to know. I remember things that I wanted to know better than everything else, which is we wanted to know more about what ESSA requires, and we wanted to know more about the connection between sort of the climate and ultimate proficiency and growth. So make sure that if there's something that comes out of this that you want to make sure we follow up on, either through staff or through a speaker, please send me a note so that I can make sure to capture it. I probably have it in here, but I don't know.
Ruth, can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
Going back to our original prompting of like, what's the point of our committee's work, to how do we define quality, to where are there rooms of improvement with our current report card and STAR framework. I feel like those are the three buckets, at least in my mind, that are sticking with me from this meeting. It could really be beneficial as a next step to have committee members to go into a chart and just answer those three questions. And then maybe you and or staff work to consolidate that for our next meeting for us to react to. Because what I think ends up happening is, like, we provide notes on the central, or we provide notes on a general frame, and it's never just coming together across all of our opinions, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, partly it doesn't because we don't all agree on everything, but that's why we do need to get it down where the agreements are and where they aren't. But what did you say your buckets were, Zach? Just let me get that down.
So just this conversation, what is the point of this committee's work, or what is our goal? How do we define quality? And what opportunities exist? Look at that assets-based language. What opportunities exist for us to eliminate bias in our current report card or STAR framework?
And I would add to that where we started, which is, and maybe this is what you mean by the point of the committee's work. What is the point of the STAR rating? Because either we're going to make our judgments based on that, or we are going to acknowledge that maybe we don't even like what it does, but still here's how we're going to judge it.
I think that's an important addition. Yeah.
Okay, so at the May meeting, and 1 minute, I sent in the memo, it says who's coming. I think it'll be very interesting. And we'll have speakers who will talk about, we'll have Sean Reardon, who will talk about his whole idea about the growth and the proficiency, which I think is pretty profound, and we'll sort of see how we can make some sense of that. And Robert Simmons, who was at Maya Angelou and is now with, is it Black Urban Teachers, or anyway, doing a lot about Black male recruitment. And, okay, and I know has a lot to say about the effect of sort of the way the system affected that. Constance Lindsay has been doing some research on, are there ways that you can capture the same thing that test scores capture, but without necessarily the test score, which is pretty interesting. And Kristen Harper from Child Trends, who I think is going to be talking about climate surveys, and Josh, who is going to be talking about the way in which this is all functioning thus far. We're going to start with a video clip from Aaron and Betsy's presentation, part of which will be to capture the sort of the data that they showed, sort of these bias issues, so that that's sort of up there for the panel to see and react to. That'll be part of the sort of the GRIS. So if there's things you want to particularly put to them or present to them prior, let us know, because we're, I know John Paul is in communication with them. So that's May. That's the May meeting. And then the next thing is what's next. And I think it's partly getting more of this information so that we can answer some questions. And, to me, it's partly, insofar as we can answer some of this, can we bridge some of the divides? That's part of what I'm looking for, is if we can answer certain questions, does it help us bridge the divides? And then the second thing is to get closer on sort of the agreements and disagreements. And I'll take a first crack at that and bring some of that to the working meeting, to the next, to our next committee meeting. And also, if there are speakers that we want to have at our next committee meeting, think about that and let me know.
Ruth, can I ask one question?
Yes.
What will we do on places where we cannot reach consensus?
Well, I mean, we're gonna have to figure out how to, I don't know, I mean, I don't have an answer to it. I mean, I think the idea for many of us is that we want to, I think this is right, that everybody here would like some improvements to be made in the framework. And, you know, we're at different places on the continuum and at different places in terms of how much is enough. And I think we have to come to some agreement about the extent to which we can all be on the same page. Obviously, if we can all be on the same page about here's a set of things we want, that is super strong. If most of us are for, you know, a set of things and one or two people aren't, you know, then a decision has to be made. You try to pass something, a set of recommendations that has the 7 people and not 9. I'm just saying, I'm just picking that out of my head. I mean, I just think that's all we're going to have to sort of start talking
about. That's what I guess I'm getting at, Ruth, is that right now this is the committee discussing research and areas of exploration, but are we working towards a resolution in which the state board says to OSSE, we would like to see XYZ changes made to the SE framework?
Yes, we're looking towards a set of recommendations. And I think with a set of arguments. I mean, because that's the world in which this happens, right? I mean, we need to make the case.
Will there be a point at which you socialize some of our thinking with OSSE before we put it to a resolution that we vote on and give to them?
To some extent we can. I mean, John Paul and I and Marcus have been talking with OSSE about it. So it's not a secret. I mean, they've seen different things. We invited them to bring a speaker to the coming meeting, and we will trade drafts. That's a good point. I think when I do the next round of this, we can share it. So yes. And as we get
to gauge a sense of where the state superintendent is willing to make changes before we so that we decide whether we're putting forward a set of recommendations that are likely to be adopted or a set of recommendations that are the minority voice, as the state superintendent might, you know, if they seem to be in conflict with what the administration plans to do.
I think those are all issues that we have to figure out. I mean, I don't have a definite answer to it, but we want to engage with the administration on it. We want to engage with ourselves. We need to have a document that allows us to engage with all of those people and with our communities, and to sort of also, you know, get some input and have a discussion on it. So
yeah, I think that would be great too, because I do know that like Page's parent survey suggests that parents really value the rating. So I think getting feedback from communities about things we propose would be really important before we make a vote.
Yeah, I think that is mainly right, but it also depends in part on our ability to sort of move this. I mean, you know, we've been moving slowly, and let's pick it up. But yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I also think, I guess I also see it as iterative, Jessica, which is there's some conversations that can go on prior to having an initial vote on something, and then there's another set of conversations that goes on, you know, with sort of an initial draft, and then you fix it. So I think there's different ways to think about it, and that's sort of part of what we have to next do. But yeah, there's a lot of discussion, and we've got to sort of figure out where we can land, and I see all of this as relevant to that. And I mean, I don't know about everybody else. I mean, I feel like to some extent, I certainly count myself in this category, that hearing from Aaron and Betsy had an effect on all of us in terms of what we think both is an issue and ways that it could be addressed, at least to some extent. And then, so that's why I'm sort of big into, if we have some other ideas that we can bring in and try to share with each other, that it can get us places. So. And I'm sorry, I kept you an extra 7 minutes. I didn't mean to. Everybody good? Bye, everybody.